If we were to find Paul's notes for an upcoming lecture he was going to give on my philosophy of ministry, we'd probably find the words of 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19 through 23, where Paul writes, and I'm quoting, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I become as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though being myself not under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings." In chapter 9, Paul defends his apostolic office and explains his methods and purposes to the Corinthians. Recall that Paul had spent a fair bit of time in Corinth, but has been in Ephesus now for several years. During his time away, many in Corinth had fallen back into pagan ways and began challenging Paul's authority and even his integrity. One thing Paul must do as he addresses the various struggles facing the Corinthians is to remind them of his calling, to share the gospel with both Jew and Gentile. Paul is an apostle. He has seen the risen Lord. Everything he has done has been to further the cause of Jesus Christ and the gospel. Paul has consistently put the needs of others first and foremost, something which Paul now expects of the Corinthians. And although entitled to financial support, Paul took nothing from them while in Corinth to set an example to the strong as to how they should treat the weak. Paul is concerned to run the race and win the prize, so that by all means he may win more to Christ. I'm Kim Riddlebarger, and this is episode 16 of our Blessed Hope Podcast Season 3, a deep dive into 1 Corinthians. We will address Paul's understanding of his Gentile mission and his response to those Corinthians questioning his integrity and his evangelistic practices. Our text is 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 1 through 27, so get out your Bibles and follow along if you can, and I think you'll find Paul's discussion to be both revealing and practical. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 1 through 27, we find an interesting chapter in which Paul essentially defends himself in light of some of the accusations coming from Corinth. And in the first two verses, Paul defends his apostolic office, writing, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I'm not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord." Although we are more than 2,000 years removed from the ancient city of Corinth, we accept Paul's apostolic teaching without question. For many, Paul is our favorite New Testament writer because he teaches so many of the doctrines which we hold dear. So it's hard for us to imagine that Paul had to defend his apostolic practices in a church which he himself helped to found and from which he had been gone but several years. Paul cannot tell the strong among the Corinthians to act in a certain way toward the weak if he himself doesn't practice what he preaches. Paul appeals to his own example in dealing with Jewish and Gentile believers in the midst of the issues facing this congregation, including the matter currently under discussion, which is idolatry and the consumption of idol food. And that's a point Paul will continue to address in chapter 10. Some commentators, such as Gordon Fee, see the issue in chapter 9 then to be a crisis of Paul's authority, as is the case in his second letter, 2 Corinthians 10 through 13, where Paul's on the defensive. But more than likely here, Paul's reminding the Corinthians of the example which he'd set for them regarding his rights as an apostle, but which he chose not to exercise as spelled out in the following verses. Perhaps a better way to understand the passage is that while at first glance Paul certainly appears defensive, a closer look indicates that Paul is defending the logic of his views as set out in chapters 8 through 10 as a whole, not his apostolic authority per se, although that's where he begins. In order to do this, Paul defends his apostolic practices with a series of 16 rhetorical questions. That, as we know, is a common practice for Paul to ask his readers questions about which he and they should know the answer. This may be because some in Corinth say that Paul is vacillating, that he's wishy-washy, or that by giving up his liberty, he's raised questions about his authority. It's even a possibility, remote I think, that Paul encouraged the strong and perhaps even ate with them, while then teaching the strong should be careful around the weak with their ill-informed scruples about idol food. If true, Paul might appear to be double-minded. In verse 1 of chapter 9, Paul asks the first 4 of these series of rhetorical questions. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my workmanship in the Lord? As to the first question, am I free? Paul clearly sees himself free from law-keeping as a means of justification. That's very clear from Galatians 2:16. The law of Moses belongs to this present evil age, and the Mosaic covenant is now obsolete or fulfilled with the coming of Christ, a point that Paul made in some detail in Galatians chapter 3, verses 15 through 29, and which he states clearly in Romans 10, verse 4. Paul is also free from the condemnation of the law because Christ has borne our condemnation on the cross, Galatians 3:13. If any Christian can rightly claim such freedom, it is Paul, as he'll go on to contend in verses 19 through 23. In Galatians 2:11 and following, and then again in chapter 5, verse 1 of Galatians, Paul argues that that sort of freedom is a fruit of the gospel. And whenever this freedom is challenged by false teachers, Paul's the first person to step up and defend it, since such freedom is a corollary of the gospel. But when it comes to the weak within the church, Paul voluntarily gives up his freedom so that the weak do not stumble. As to the second and third questions, Paul is reminding the Corinthians of what they already know. Paul is an apostle because Jesus himself appeared to him while Paul was on his way to Damascus to hunt down and persecute Christians. Now, of course, is recounted in Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 31. The office of apostle is not something Paul had sought because of any kind of personal ambition. Paul's office as apostle has its basis and its authority in Christ's call. Like the other apostles, Paul has seen the risen Christ, and therefore Paul's gospel and apostolic practices come from Jesus, since it was Jesus who called Paul to this office of apostle to the Gentiles. And finally, it was through Paul's efforts to preach the gospel that the Corinthian church was born. It's the result of Paul's work in the Lord. Paul planted or founded the church in Corinth. He's its father in the sense that he was the instrument used by God. The very existence of this congregation is the answer to Paul's fourth question. It's a point Paul made previously back in chapter 3, verse 6. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. As Paul points out in his fifth question in verse 2, if to others I'm not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. And while some, the Jews, may have called Paul's apostolic credentials into question, the Corinthians ought to be the last to do so. Paul had been in their midst for 18 months, so they know him well, and they saw how he lived. The existence of this congregation constitutes empirical verification of Paul's apostolic credentials. If the Corinthians deny the validity of Paul's work as an apostle, they are, in effect, denying their own validity as a congregation. The term translated here as seal, sphragus, indicates a mark of authority or ownership, and is a term used of the impression made in wax by signet rings, the seal. It's used of Christ's ownership of Christians in Revelation chapter 7, verse 3. In this case, it is Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, who functions as Christ's seal upon this church through his apostolic office. The Corinthians should know who Paul is and what authority he possesses. Well, in verses 3 through 14, Paul explains his rights as an apostle, and he writes beginning in verse 3, "This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas," Peter? "Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does the law not say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, 'You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain.' It is for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing the crop. If we've sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who preach the gospel should get their living by the gospel." Well, what follows in verse 3 gets at the heart of Paul's ministry as apostle to the Gentiles. "This is my defense to those who would examine me." Here, Paul offers an apologia, a term for a legal defense against those who sit in judgment, which is also a legal term, upon his ministry. As an apostle, he has the same rights as do all the other apostles. So let the Corinthians examine him along the line of the next 7 rhetorical questions that follow. In effect, he's putting the Corinthians on the witness stand and examining them. As commentators Chomp and Rosner put it, I'm quoting, Paul offers a defense that attacks the defenses of anyone opposing him. So he's flipped the rhetorical tables on the Corinthians. His first question gets to the matter of support for his work. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Well, way back in 1 Corinthians 8, verse 9, Paul had spoken of the rights, the exousia, of the Corinthians to eat certain foods. But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. At the very least, Paul is reminding the Corinthians that he has a legitimate right to eat and drink all things just as the strong were claiming, since all things have been created by God and can be sanctified through prayer, as seen in passages we've already cited, Romans 14:20 and 1 Timothy 4, verse 5. The context tells us that the food and drink to which Paul is referring is that associated with his personal needs being met by the church in exchange for his service. That Paul is speaking of personal sustenance and not Christian liberty is supported by the fact that Paul uses the plural, we, indicating that this is true of all those who serve in the church. Furthermore, verse 5 makes this plain when Paul asks, do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? So while Paul assumes the right for apostles to be married, which is a bit of an embarrassing problem for Rome with their notion of clerical celibacy, especially since the first pope had a mother-in-law, that is, Peter was married. Paul argues that the apostles ought to have the right to travel with their wives at the church's expense while they conduct their apostolic ministries. John Calvin felt so strongly about Rome's ignoring Paul's comments here that he writes very sarcastically, "The apostles did not shrink from marriage like the papal clergy, who detest it so much because it does not befit the sanctity of their order." And he goes on to say, "But it was later than the apostles that men lit upon the remarkable piece of wisdom that the priests of the Lord are defiled if they have intercourse with their lawful wives." Who said Calvin was dull and boring? Paul here mentions Peter by name, which indicates that Peter traveled with Mrs. Peter to the area. So while it was common knowledge that the churches provided for Peter and his wife, and what Paul means by that is food and lodging, they did so while they were conducting church business. That Peter was present in Corinth for a time would also explain why he was considered a head of one of the factions which were forming in the church. Paul also mentions that the other apostles and the Lord's brothers were married. The latter is certainly a reference to Jesus' half-brothers, which indicates that Mary and Joseph had biological children together after our Lord was born, and the perpetual virginity of Mary is always a subject of some debate, and we won't get into that here. In verse 6, the apostle asks, "Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living?" Paul and Barnabas apparently were two apostles who supported themselves by working conventional day jobs rather than rely upon support from the churches, hence the phrase tent-making ministries. Paul asks, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit, or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? These rhetorical questions illustrate the point that soldiers and vine dressers and shepherds receive the fruit of their labors for their own personal sustenance. The implication is obvious. The same thing should be true for the apostles, who should have their needs met by those whom they serve. In verses 8 to 9, Paul bolsters this point by appealing to Deuteronomy 25, verse 4. "Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox when it treads out the grain." It is for oxen that God is concerned? Well, the way the question's phrased indicates that Paul expects the reader to answer in the negative. No, of course not. The law of Moses speaks directly to this subject. When a draft animal like an ox pulls the millstone that crushed the heads of grain, the wind then blew away the chaff while the grain remained behind. If the oxen was not muzzled, the animal was able to sustain itself in its heavy labor by eating some of the grain that it had crushed. But if you muzzle that ox so that it can't eat the grain, it'll die. When Paul asks the question, is God really concerned about the ox? His point is, yes, God's concerned about the ox, which is why this matter is included in the law. If the principle goes beyond the needs of an ox, if an ox is entitled to eat, then surely the man who labors in the gospel ministry is entitled to the fruit of their labors. In this case, the apostles who labor to preach and teach and work to plant churches are worthy of their labor as well. That this is plain is clear from the next question, verse 10, when Paul asks, "Does he not speak entirely for our sake? Was it written for our sake? Because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop." Well, this time Paul's rhetorical question is to be answered in the affirmative. The illustration of an ox being able to eat the grain it crushes supports the greater principle that those who labor are entitled to the fruit of their labor. As the plowman and the thresher eat what their fields produce, the same thing should be true for those who labor in the work of the gospel, as teaching, preaching, providing pastoral care, and so on. And that's a point which Paul will now make very specifically in verse 11. "If I have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you?" Well, the question is phrased to indicate the conditions already been fulfilled. If he has sown spiritual seed, and obviously Paul and the others have done so, then like the plowman and the thresher, those who labor in the gospel should reap a material harvest. That is, their needs should be met. Unfortunately, the prosperity gospel preachers have so distorted this passage, they've turned material need into luxury items like jets, fancy homes, and fancy cars. Paul makes the point in verse 12. If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we've not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Well, there's some important historical background, and I'm going to quote Tom Schreiner at length because I think he points out several things we need to consider. Quoting, Paul's integrity in financial matters was of paramount importance in his ministry. And he cites Acts 20, 33 through 35, 2 Corinthians 12, verses 14 to 18, and 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 9. Schreiner says, Paul was probably at a stage in his relationship with the Corinthians when he did not want them to understand the relationship in terms of a patron-client relationship, which were ubiquitous in the Greco-Roman world, and if the Corinthians thought Paul was their client, expectations would be placed upon him that could limit his ministry. If the Corinthians were Paul's patrons, then he would need to fulfill his role as their client. End of quote. Well, from Paul's comments, it is clear that others who have labored among the Corinthians had been supported by the church. Peter and Apollos have already been specifically mentioned. And since Paul did not take any support, some of the Corinthians concluded that he wasn't entitled to it, so that his apostolic authority was somehow less than the others, especially those back in Jerusalem. But if others were supported by the congregation, and since Paul was the father or founder of this congregation, shouldn't Paul be every bit as entitled as the others? Well, Paul's ultimate concern is to do nothing that might hinder the spread of the gospel. His sacrifice was voluntary, and not in any sense an indication that his authority was less than the others. The rhetorical question in verse 13 and the comment following in verse 14 tell us that Paul's hearers should have understood the answer to his question. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Well, Paul's not referring to Greco-Roman temples because there are loud echoes here from the Old Testament. He's talking about the temple. According to Leviticus 6, verses 8 through 18, those who worked in the temple earned their livelihood by doing so, as do those who maintain the altar. Furthermore, the Lord himself has commanded that those who preach should likewise earn their living through preaching. Well, that brings us up to chapter 9, verses 15 to 18, when Paul talks about voluntarily giving up his rights. In verse 15, he says, But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me ground for boasting. For necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. Then what is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. Well, Paul doesn't exercise his rights that we've just spelled out, as he's now going to explain here. He voluntarily gave them up. And so in verse 15 he tells us, But I've made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure such provision. For I'd rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for preaching. He's not whining or complaining. He's explaining to the Corinthians why he's chosen not to take that to which he's entitled. Paul's not asking the Corinthians to support him, even though he's entitled to support. The apostle is adamant about this and even states that he'd rather die than take anything from them. And his words here echoed those of the prophet Jeremiah. Woe is me, my mother, that you bore me, a man of strife and contention in the whole land. I have not lent, nor have I borrowed, yet all of them curse me. Jeremiah 15:10. Well, the apostle here is obviously speaking rhetorically, but nevertheless, we see him get emotional about the point, as we can see in verse 16. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. While Paul can boast about not taking support, even though he's entitled to it, there's only one woe for Paul if he does not preach the gospel. Preaching is his calling. There is no reason for him to boast about what Christ called him to do. This is not what he lives to do. This is what he feels compelled to do, to preach Christ. Again, Paul's words here contain a loud echo from the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah 20, verse 9. If I say, I will not mention him, or speak any more in his name, there is in my heart, as it were, a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I'm weary with holding it in, and I cannot. Paul will not allow anything to get in the way of the task to which Jesus has called him, and that is to preach the gospel. As Paul goes on to say in verse 17, for if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I'm still entrusted with his stewardship. Well, this has been a notorious verse to translate and to interpret. Paul probably means that even though he preaches the gospel freely and without pay, nevertheless, he is entitled to a reward, a wage. But since Paul has been called by Christ and is therefore a slave of Christ, he has no choice but to do as he's done. He is fulfilling that obligation which Jesus Christ has laid upon him. And he's not reluctant to preach as some might expect. He's not talking about how he feels. He's not whining. But he's talking about his status. Paul is responsible to God and can do nothing else but preach Christ and him crucified. As he tells us in verse 18, what then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. Paul has to preach. He can't do anything else. And there's a sense here in which the apostle is saying that it's his proper pay, as it were, to preach the gospel without being paid. And while the gospel gives him certain rights, pay included, it is his personal privilege not to exercise these rights so as to set an example to the strong in how they treat the weak in Corinth. Well, that brings us to verses 19 through 23, where Paul now talks about his freedom, his purpose, his mission. This is why he does what he does. For though I'm free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law, in other words, the Gentiles. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. If there's one place in Paul's letter where he gives us a glimpse into his philosophy of ministry, to use a modern expression, it's here. This is not a treatise on law and gospel as much as it is a follow-up to the previous discussion. Paul sees his role as placing himself in the position of his hearers so as to be most effective when he preaches the gospel to them. As Schreiner points out, quoting, Paul's motivation was fundamentally missional, not cultural. That's not to say that Paul lacks sensitivity to cultural circumstances, but we're reminded that his primary motivation was evangelistic. End of quote. Now this becomes clear in the following verses, especially verse 19, For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. This is a dramatic declaration that while Paul is free, he also regards himself as a servant. According to Witherington, quoting, Paul indicates his modus operandi. He sees himself as free of all obligations from all persons, yet he's made himself a slave to all in order to win over more of them. He accommodates his style of living, not his theological or ethical principles, to whomever he is with so as to better win that person to Christ. In short, he's flexible in his general lifestyle, food, clothing, and the like. End of quote. His reason for doing this is simple: to win as many people to Jesus Christ as possible. That little phrase, to win people, is a Jewish practice. It reflects doing what was necessary to make it easy for people to convert, as rabbis were frequently willing to do with proselytes. Paul uses the term 5 times in these verses. The term to win, kerdeso, can have the sense of getting somebody to agree, as in 1 Peter 3:1, and it's used by Jesus in Matthew 18:15 of winning back a struggling Christian. If your brother sins against me, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. Paul's reference to freedom might be the same here as in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 1, which is a theological reference to the law and its condemnation as part of the Mosaic economy. The idea may be the same as in Galatians 5:13, where Paul writes, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." Although less likely, this might also be in reference to Paul's Roman citizenship, since Paul was a freedman. The point is that Paul regards himself as a slave to everyone, including the Corinthians. His servant in Corinth is voluntary, but he's been called to be a bondservant of Jesus. Well, Paul spells out how he understands his work in verse 20. To the Jews, I become like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I become like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. Well, to start with, Paul has impeccable Jewish credentials. As he writes in Philippians 3, verses 4-6, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also, if anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. Well, Paul has quite an impressive resume when he seeks to win Jews to faith in Jesus Christ. And Paul will affirm later that because he is in union with Christ, Romans 10, verse 4, the Lord is the end of the law for everyone who believes. Paul is not bound to the Sinaitic covenant of his people, the Jews. But when approaching Jews to preach Christ to them, Paul lived like one under the law so as to win those under the law. Now, Paul was very careful about what he ate, and he respected Jewish traditions and customs, the so-called boundary markers which divided Jew from Gentile. These are things like circumcision and dietary laws and ceremonial washings, keeping the feast days, and so on, so as not to put obstacles in the way of his Jewish hearers considering the claims of Christ, who fulfilled everything to which the law of Moses had pointed. And that explains why Paul ordered Timothy, who was born a Greek, to be circumcised in Acts 16, verses 1-3, and why, when in Jerusalem, Paul actually participated in the Jewish rite of purification, according to Acts 21, 20-26. Paul shows great respect for Jewish customs, so as to diffuse objections of antinomianism and to establish or maintain common ground with his people. One writer puts it, Paul, quote, asked Jews not so much to give up the practice of the law as their confidence in it. Their trust must be in Christ, end of quote. And therefore, even though Paul's free from the law, he's perfectly willing to live as a Jew, as if under the law, to lead a Jew to Christ. But when he's with Gentiles, Paul is willing to live as a Gentile. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I'm not free from the law of God, but I'm under the law of Christ, so as to win those not having the law. As he did with the Jews, Paul also met Gentiles on their own ground. And a good illustration of this can be seen in his various sermons to the Gentiles, such as Acts 17, verse 22. When Paul says he becomes as one not under the law, he's not telling us he's willing to behave lawlessly if and when the Gentiles do, since he's still under the law of Christ, which is the moral law. Paul also affirms that in the presence of Gentiles, he doesn't live as a Jew as one under the Mosaic economy, which means he probably ate Gentile food and he observed local customs if and when they were not tied to idolatry. When Paul is with the Jews, he lives as a Jew. When Paul is with the Gentiles, he lives as a Gentile. He does so to avoid putting any obstacle in the way of preaching the gospel to either. Food and cultural practices should not be an obstacle to evangelism. Well, Paul now sets forth what really amounts to a philosophy of ministry. He'd probably cringe at that definition, but nevertheless, that's what it is. To the weak, I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. When Paul makes a reference to the categories of people found in Corinth, the weak, Jews, Gentiles, and so on, and then speaks of living like a Jew or a Gentile, he does so for the express purpose of preaching the gospel to them by eliminating obstacles to the faith. Let's get rid of all the peripheral junk and get right to the heart of it. Was Christ raised from the dead? He was crucified for sinners, and so on. The weak are those who are already Christians, but have not yet been able to sift out all these pagan habits and temptations and practices like the strong have already done. Paul has made plain his concern for those Christians who are struggling, whose consciences are burdened by things for which Christ has died and with which they shouldn't be struggling. When among the weak, Paul behaves as one who is weak, so as to win the weak and bring them to a position where they may become strong. The issue here is the weak can't pull the strong down to the level of the weak. The strong have to be patient and pull the weak up to the level of the strong. As for new Christians or those who are still weak, Paul hopes to win them so their weak consciences won't be overcome, causing them to leave the church. Paul respects such people's scruples about meat sacrificed to idols, and he avoids doing anything to offend them. But his goal certainly is not to leave them in this weak position, but by being patient and instructing them to strengthen them so that they're no longer weak. The strong must bear with the weak, with the goal of helping the weak move on to maturity, not leaving them in weakness nor dragging down the church into a state of weakness. When Paul speaks of becoming all things to all men for the sake of the gospel, we must not take Paul to mean that he's an unprincipled pragmatist, that he'll do anything that works so as to lead people to Christ. The end, evangelism, does not justify the means, watering down the gospel to get a greater response. Paul never changes the gospel he preaches, but he does change how he approaches those to whom he's preaching. There's no evidence anywhere in the New Testament that Paul would let personal considerations and cultural differences get in the way of the gospel. Paul's able to see the big picture and not let non-essential things get in the way of his apostolic mission, which, as he tells us, was to do everything possible so as to preach the gospel, so as to see people, Jew or Gentile, come to faith in Jesus Christ. Well, that's a good place to take a bit of a break. So far, we've considered Paul's discussion of his apostolic office, his rights as an apostle, and how he has set those rights aside so as to be an example to the strong as to how they should treat the weak. Paul has preached the gospel free of charge, finding his reward in the success of the message of Christ crucified, of which the Corinthians are the reward. Paul has given us what amounts to his approach to ministry. He does whatever is necessary to preach the gospel to both Jew and Gentile. This section of Paul's Corinthian letter has given us a fascinating look into his mission and what the Lord has led him to accomplish. Show notes for this and all past episodes of the prior seasons of the Blessed Hope podcast are Season 1 in Galatians, Season 2 on the Thessalonian letters, and a series called The Future, and all the past episodes of Paul's First Corinthian letter. All of that can be found at the Riddle blog. That's kimriddlebarger.com, lowercase, all one word, kimriddlebarger.com. If you're new to the Blessed Hope podcast, well, be sure to check out the Riddle blog. There's lots of stuff there. Info on my books, lots of biblical exposition, my commentaries on the Reformed Confessions, my musings in which I let my hair down, along with years of sermons preached at Christ Reformed Church, and then a lot of recommended reading on a host of topics. If the Blessed Hope podcast has been of value to you, well, please tell others about our deep dive into the letters of Paul. We are doing something I don't think anybody else is doing, and that's taking a deep dive into these letters. So it really helps when you share new episodes on your social media and when new episodes are released. So when a new episode drops and you see it on my social media, share it and forward it. That would be really helpful. Likes, subscriptions, and comments are great because they help others find the Blessed Hope podcast when they use a search engine to look for it. Now, again, broken record, but I encourage you to read through 1 Corinthians and the other letters of Paul we've covered so far on a regular basis. That's the goal of the podcast. So find a quiet spot and read through 1 Corinthians in two parts maybe, chapters 1 through 6 and 7 through 16, or find a good audio of 1 Corinthians read aloud and go through it if you're a commuter. A lot of folks do that too. These are all great ways to become familiar with these remarkable letters which speak in profound ways to a number of the issues facing Christians today. One of the best ways to resist the spirit of the age is to study the letters of Paul, who was pretty good at tackling the spirit of his own age. And so with that, let's get back to our text, picking up where we left off in verse 24, as Paul describes running the race that is living the Christian life with determination and always keeping the final goal in mind. Well, Paul closes out this chapter with an exhortation and gives us an example in verses 24 to 27 of chapter 9. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we have an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. Well, Paul concludes the section begun back in verse 1 of this chapter, and his readers, of course, were thoroughly conversant with athletic metaphors, just as in our own culture. Recall that the Isthmian Games were held every 2 years in Corinth, including the years 49 and 51 CE, when Paul may have actually been in the city. The Olympic Games were held nearby every 4 years. So Paul's reference to sporting events make perfect sense in light of this widespread familiarity with the games and the athletic contests which compose them. Because of the stress in athletics found upon personal sacrifice and discipline and self-control, referring to athletic events was a practice of Greek and Roman philosophers as well as Jewish sources. We know this from Philo and from 4th Maccabees. So it says Paul in verse 24, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. In foot races, which were the first events held in the pentathlon, there's only one possible winner. And that's why runners not only have to be careful to prepare themselves beforehand, but then to pace themselves during the race. Paul's point in verse 25 is simply that Christians are to go about the business of the kingdom of God with the sort of deliberation of a runner preparing for a race. As Paul tells us, every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we have an imperishable. Well, competitors in important races can't go in unprepared. They follow a strict training regimen. Olympic runners, for example, swore allegiance to Zeus that they would spend 10 full months in preparation, during which time they swore to live temperate lives during very difficult training. And if they won their respective races, they got a pine garland or a celery wreath, which lasted but a couple of days. That's a rather poor price for all that hard work. Hey, you get a stalk of celery. Have fun with that. Christians, on the other hand, were concerned with eternal things that can't perish like a celery stalk. Whatever reward they receive, whether Paul means a literal crown or not, is an open question, but that reward's one that's going to last forever. In 2 Timothy 4, verse 8, Paul puts it this way: "There is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing." So Paul is clearly cognizant of this parallel in his own approach to ministry and to the Christian life with that of an athlete. To be a faithful preacher of the gospel, as well as a Christian seeking to persevere to the end in faith, that requires the same determined attitude as someone preparing for a race. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. Boxing was one of the main features of the Greek athletic games. And so, as you know, if you're going to box, you got to toughen up your hands and your stomach muscles so as to be able to endure a long fight. Shadow boxing doesn't cut it. Knowing what lies ahead, Paul understands exactly where the finish line is. He knows the direction he must go, and he must devote himself to the challenges ahead. Paul doesn't run aimlessly. He doesn't beat the air. No, he's disciplined himself so that his body will not be consumed by those things that prevent him from competing effectively. Paul's not going to take the easy way. He's not going to seek pleasure at the expense of personal discipline, so that through his own actions, he doesn't disqualify himself from receiving the prize for which he's trained. Now, contrary to some commentators, this assertion that Paul might be disqualified for the prize has nothing whatsoever to do with someone potentially losing their salvation. This is a metaphor about how we approach the Christian life and does not speak to the matter of the perseverance of the saints, which is the question of whether or not a Christian can lose their salvation. Leon Morris is absolutely correct to note, quoting, "Paul's fear was not that he might lose his salvation, but that he might suffer loss through failing to satisfy his Lord." End of quote. For Paul, the test which might disqualify him had nothing to do with his standing before God. He's already told us that's settled, according to 1 Corinthians 1:30 and 6:11. But whether or not he'd be able to submit everything he did to the gospel, to the end for which he was called. Well, with that, we've come to the end of the chapter, and Paul's main point is clear. Because we have been rescued from God's wrath by Christ's death upon the cross, and because we are reckoned righteous because Christ's righteousness is imputed to us through faith, cultural things like food and drink become a matter of indifference, adiaphora, which characterizes the strong in Corinth. That is, unless someone thinks eating something or drinking something is wrong, and then stumbles when a stronger Christian flaunts their liberty in front of them. Christians must be willing to give up their liberty for a time so that a weak Christian becomes strong. But that's only for a time, and only until the weak become strong, and their consciences are no longer bound to things that God does not forbid. Part of our sanctification is learning how to responsibly enjoy our Christian liberty, which has been won for us by the life and death of Christ. Now, like Paul in evangelistic contexts, we should strive to become all things to all people for the sake of the gospel. And that doesn't mean changing or modifying the gospel to make it more palatable or acceptable to people. This does mean not letting trivial or cultural things distract people from the key issue. That is, that the law of God condemns us and that we're saved by Christ through the gospel. This simply means that if people are offended, and many are going to be, let them be offended by the preaching of Christ crucified and not because of matters of food and drink. Paul was willing to do everything to remove obstacles for the sake of the gospel, because Paul knew that food and drink are nothing, but the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. Well, next time we'll dive into chapter 10 and take up Paul's discussion of idolatry in Corinth, which has many ramifications for us as we face a renewed idolatry associated with this worldview move that so many are making from biblical Christianity to spirituality. And much of modern spirituality is nothing but ancient idolatry, as we're going to see. We'll take up Paul's explanation as to why the Corinthians must distance themselves from all their former pagan practices, including avoiding pagan temples, pagan religious ceremonies, as well as eating food which had been sacrificed to idols. And this is especially compelling for us, since we now face so many pagan practices in our own day and age. Until next time, Maranatha, come quickly, Lord Jesus.